This event is the first of a two-part event that we're hosting in our Public Dialogues and Race series. Sometime during the next academic year, we will follow up this event with another discussion of white nationalism. So please stay tuned if you're on our email list. We designed this event to coincide with an exhibit on Flannery O'Connor, Alice Walker, and Benny Andrews that's currently at the Shatton Gallery at Woodruff Library. This exhibit was one of the last ideas of our dear departed colleague, Dr. Pelham McDaniels, who was the curator of African American collections. And so we honor his memory today by having this discussion. The inspiration for that exhibit was a class that Pelham taught with my co-moderator tonight, Joe Crespino, who's the Jimmy Carter Professor of History and Chair of the History Department. So in a few moments, Joe is going to explain the connections between O'Connor in particular and tonight's discussion. But let me start with by drawing more slightly modern connections to O'Connor. So when we think about white liberalism and race, we could think about the young people who participated in Freedom Summer, particularly the martyrs like Michael Schwerner or Andrew Goodman. And we can also think about whites who dedicated their time and treasure to anti-racist movements. And contemporary examples of that could include people like Tim Wise or Robin DiAngelo. But there are also other characterizations of white liberalism that we want to discuss today. So my pop culture references tend to veer older than me, so it's stuff I watch in reruns, but that really I wasn't born for. And this does totally reflect my television taste. But I think about the late Norman Lear's classic characters, Mike Stivic or Maud Finley, self-proclaimed liberals with big blind spots on race and other issues. And we can project things on that those characters might say in a contemporary context. Things like, some of my best friends are Black. I voted for Obama. I gave to Black Lives Matter. Right? So let's talk a little bit more about Black Lives Matter, particularly in light of George Floyd's murder in 2020. After that senseless, horrific event, we saw companies issuing statements and investing more heavily in DEI programs. And today, not even 4 years later, we're seeing a rollback of those efforts. Some of those rollbacks are in response to a political backlash against diversity, but let's be honest, some of this probably would have happened even if there wasn't a war on woke. So this is because the platitudes were empty. This is because there were well-meaning folks who only planned on saying things and didn't actually plan on doing things, and they only wanted to express thoughts and prayers. So these are the types of things that we are going to discuss tonight. So after his own comments and contextualization, my colleague, Joe Crespino, is going to introduce the panel, and we will start the discussion. So with that, please join me in welcoming my co-moderator, Dr. Joe Crespino.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Great. Thanks so much, Andra. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I do want to remember this afternoon our colleague, Pelham McDaniel, who I was teaching a class in which I had assigned Flannery O'Connor's story, Everything That Rises Must Converge. Who's read that story before? Okay. Who's attended or seen the exhibit in the Shatton Gallery about the story? Okay, great. All right. Well, if you haven't done it yet, I hope you'll go over there. This talk really is in reaction to and in conversation with that exhibit. The story by Flannery O'Connor was published in the early 60s. I believe it's the last story that she published before she died. And it is the story of a white mother kind of from the Old South who is traveling to her slimming class at the YMCA. And her son, Julian, who's a recent college graduate, is accompanying her on the Atlanta city buses, and she is intent on him going with her because she is upset about the recent integration of the city buses in Atlanta, which had just happened. And the story is about what happens to them on the bus ride. And in typical Flannery O'Connor fashion, there is a big tragedy at the end. It's not exactly clear what happens, but it involves this encounter on the bus with an African-American woman and her young son. And it's a story that I always like to teach because I want to I'm always interested in who do the students identify with in the story? Do they identify with the young son who's kind of, like for his era, he's kind of the woke young college graduate, or, and that's typically what students identify with. And the mother is a very, she's a very conventional figure, racist, condescending, kind of from an old Southern family that has fallen on hard times now. It's a fascinating story, and I can talk more about it later, but basically that story, I was teaching that story, and I told Pelham, and Pelham said, oh, we have this amazing book by Benny Andrews, the African-American artist, who's from the same area of Georgia where Flannery O'Connor's from. And he illustrated the story, which is surprising because the story does not, it portrays a kind of stereotypical and kind of derogatory portrait of the African-American mother. I mean, you can read the story in different ways, but that's generally the way I read the story. But Benny Andrews, in this really gracious gesture, in a very empathetic way, was kind of reading the story and wanted to illustrate the story. And there are amazing illustrations there that are on display in the Shatton Gallery. And so Pelham told me about this, and so I brought my class, and the pictures are there with the text of the story, and we just read the story together as a class. It was the best things I've ever done as a teacher. And then talked about the illustrations. And at the end of that, Pelham's like, Joe, we ought to do an exhibit about this. And I was like, that's a great idea. We should absolutely do that. And we were planning on doing that when Pelham passed away early during COVID. Another team, I was not able to follow through with it, but another team of curators picked it up and ran with it, and that's the exhibit that is there now. So I really encourage you to go see it. But that story and thinking, and so that's a historical story. It's a piece of historical fiction. It's set in it was written in the early 1960s. It's set in the kind of the mid 1950s. That's when the Atlanta buses desegregated. And so I'm a historian, and we have several historians, scholars of religion here, and we're going to talk about white liberalism, both from a historical perspective, how it's changed over time, but we'll also have a wide-ranging discussion in other ways too. So let me go ahead and introduce our panel of experts. I'm going to start with my colleague, Nichole Renee Phillips, who is Associate Professor in the Practice of Religion and Society and Director of Black Church Studies here at the Candler School of Theology. Nichole is a sociologist of religion and public intellectual. She teaches courses in community and congregational studies. Her research interests lie at the intersection of religion and American public life, with a focus on community and congregational studies, where she investigates the moral commitments and vision of community and congregational members. Her scholarship treats religion, critical race, gender, cultural memory studies, and the sociology of science and religion. She's formerly an Andrew Mellon Fellow in Religion and Humanities. She was the first fellow in Emory University's Mellon Foundation Humanistic Inquiry Program to be appointed at the professional schools. And she is a senior faculty fellow at the Center for Ethics. And her first monograph is called Patriotism, Black and White, The Color of American Exceptionalism, which was published in 2018. To Nichole's left is Sarah Gardner. Sarah Gardner is the Distinguished University Professor at Mercer University, where she regularly teaches courses on the rise and fall of plantation slavery in the U.S. South, the U.S. during the Civil War era, and the world that the Civil War made. She is the author of Blood and Irony, Southern White Women's Narratives of the Civil War, 1861 to 1937, and Reviewing the South, the Literary Marketplace and the Southern Renaissance, from 1920 to 1940. She's also co-edited 3 collections of essays, including, most recently, The Lost Lectures of C. Van Woodward. And to Sarah's left is Alison Collis Greene. Alison Greene is Associate Professor of American Religious History here at Candler School of Theology, where she directs the Master's in Theological Studies program and teaches courses in the histories of U.S. religion, race, politics, and economics. Her first book, No Depression in Heaven, The Great Depression, the New Deal, and the Transformation of Religion in the Delta, was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. And she's currently working on a book entitled Backwater, Religion, Community, and Justice in a Jim Crow Swamp. Great. And so I will start us off with questions. Is that right? Okay. All right. My first question is to each of our panelists, and we can go in whatever order we want to. How does white liberalism come up in your work in teaching and activism?
Well, I'll jump in here.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you.
I really do work at the intersection of race, religion, and nationalism. And white liberalism would come up really in terms of my teaching and conversations around race and religion. So for instance, last semester I taught a course I entitled Gender, Race, Religion, and Nation, where I looked at the constructs of gender, race, and religion in shaping American society as well as the church. And what does that look like? Many people often uplift the greatest dividing line in America as being race, but many others say it's gender. And so in my course, when we look at the issues of race and gender and the ways in which both interact in American society as well as in the church, we recognize the prominence of gender. And so there's an aspect of the syllabus where, of course, we're going to treat race and racial formations. And so already stated, we look at the book and we study, we study the precursor to white fragility, which I'm making no claims about Robin DiAngelo because I don't know her. However, that book can be taken as an exemplar of white liberalism. And I'll leave it to my colleagues to get into the critical edges around white liberalism, but that is a book that I uplift or at least we engage when we're talking about race. And so that would be an exemplar of white liberalism.
Thank you.
All right.
You sold it down, yes.
Okay. Better? Yeah. All right. I'm gonna start with probably not an obvious way of getting at this question, and that is one of the things I'm doing right now with my students. It's about a particular book. I'm teaching a course on the rise and fall of plantation slavery, and we're looking at the evidence that the author uses. And I mention all of the criticism that has come out in, book reviews, professional journals about the book. And the criticism that comes out is that there's only one collection that the author has used that comes from the planter's perspective. There's only one body of evidence that comes from, say, planters' letters or their their journals. And the rest of their evidence comes from other places, like the WPA and the Federal Writers Project, which were conducted during the 1930s, and interviews with the formerly enslaved and their descendants. So why, I ask my students, let us think right now, why there is criticism about the author's source material. Right, now my students are really quite astute. They got it before I even got the question out. All right, that do we take as credible witnesses the formerly enslaved? In the same way that we would take as a credible source the writings of a planter, a planter's mistress, an enslaver. Because that is what the criticism is saying. that some of those, right, pieces of evidence, the articulation of what it meant to be in the South, some of that is credible and some of it is not. And the work that is credible is the work that comes from the planter's records and not from the testimony of the formerly enslaved. Right, so I start there, right, and that is a kind of privilege, right, to think that some testimony is credible because it was created by, right, a particular person at a particular time who had a particular vested interest.
We have one more person than Mike, so we're gonna trade back and forth. When Andra and Drew asked me to do this, I said I'm not an expert on white liberalism, so I don't really know why you're asking me, and I'm gonna say again, I'm not really an expert on white liberalism. I am an expert on religion, race, and politics in the modern South. Does that mean twice?
Yeah.
Feedback, little distance here. And if you work on religion and race and politics in the modern South, you do actually have to engage with white liberalism. And my first book was about religion and the Great Depression and the New Deal in the South. And a lot of historians might argue that the New Deal is the greatest triumph of white liberalism. So it does actually intersect with some of the things I do. I can speak to white liberalism, but maybe one indication of my lack of expertise is that Julian, to me, did not read as a white liberal or woke, right? He read to me as a kid who wants to make a point to his mom by doing the thing that will piss her off the most, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, and sort of thinking through these questions and through this conversation, I think you have a question about the way the category of white liberalism changes over time. I will say you have this question about activism. I don't put myself within the circle of white liberalism. I would put myself a little bit to the left of it. And so but you know, some of my best friends are white liberals. So I think that talking about the way that this category changes over time and the way that the politics of this category can become really expansive and then also sometimes really small is a useful line of conversation to have here at some point. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Before I get into the next question, which is about definitions, thinking of other pop culture examples, I do not remember the name of this movie, but does anybody remember a movie from the late 80s, maybe early 90s about a white guy who bronzes himself so that he can qualify for affirmative action at Harvard Law School?
Black like
No, not the book, yeah.
Not the book, okay.
Yes, this is a comedy.
Oh, yeah.
Right, and then there's this character in the movie of a young white woman who pursues him romantically because she's always trying to live vicariously through people of color, and also it seems like she might be trying to take her parents off. And he goes through and he does this so that he can benefit from affirmative action, and then he has to experience racism, and so it's about all the things that he learns as a result of it. And then it was really interesting, when he gets exposed as really being a white man, this girlfriend drops him, and then the next one, boyfriend that she picks up happens to be like a Native American, and so it's really offensive sort of characterization of it. It's a man in headdress, but it makes the point that she, drops one kind of form of tokenism for another form of tokenism. And just thinking about, okay, what do people do when they kind of treat people as objects and projects and not as full human beings that you can participate in? But I say all that to say, the definition of white liberalism has changed over time. So Sarah, can you kind of walk us through the quick and dirty evolution of what that term has meant in different eras?
Yeah, so I'm sorry for conflating white privilege and white liberalism, but I do kind of smush them together. Early, the classic definition of liberalism is small government, not a lot of bureaucracy, right? Skeptical of institutions, right? And emphasis on liberty, freedom of choice, with some kind of assumption that because that is part of the definition of what it means to be liberal, that it translates the same way across the board. Right? Wouldn't it be pretty to think so? So that's the classic definition of liberalism. I think the way it's changed over time in many different iterations is I tend to think of liberals now, white liberals have faith in institutions, and especially education, right? That we can educate ourselves and be better people. Right, and again, that will play out equally. So I was talking earlier, and this I'll be really brief. This is a personal. This is my life kind of moment. If anyone has read Laura Meckler's book, Dreamtown, Shaker Heights, and the Quest for Racial Equity, right? That was the school system I went through. Right, so I was part, didn't know it at the time, I was part of an experiment. Right, and so were all of my classmates. Right, to try to achieve racial equity, not equality, equity. Right, and they're deliberate about that topic. So that is what my educational system looked like. So I am a product, right, of this kind of white liberalism, of faith that this will work, and that an institution can do this work.
May I ask a question? You emphasized that you come out of this background of racial equity, not racial equality. So clearly you are making a distinction. Can you help me and us understand the distinction that you're making? We conflate the term, even though they are different. But we often conflate equity and equality. So what do you mean?
And I'll go back to something that might sound a bit like my definition of liberalism to begin with, and that is the idea that we are all equal under the law. Right, but that doesn't mean, right, that we experience it the same way. Right, and so my school system, it did a lot of things wrong and it did a lot of things right. It was an experiment, and well-intentioned, but the goal wasn't equality. We can say that a million times over, and we're not going to achieve equality in the way that I think it gets bandied about, right? So this was an attempt at equity.
So Sarah, you talk about your experience growing up in Ohio. There is a regional component historically to white liberalism. And so, but you also have studied kind of artists from the Renaissance who would be considered, Southern liberal writers of that era. So how do you think about the differences between historical evolution, maybe a difference between Southern white liberalism and Northern liberalism, as those things have been kind of distinguished over the course of the 20th century? So.
Yeah, since you brought up the book on the Renaissance, I mean, one of the things that's interesting, and I think this is still the
and maybe tell ours what is the Southern Renaissance?
The Southern Renaissance, a period of flourishing in literature. I'm thinking of it in terms of literature, Southern literature, and it's getting away from the myth of the plantation. It's getting away from plantation narratives like Dixon, all right, the Klansman, all right, those kind of tales, but also the Moonlight and Magnolia, right, sort of stereotype of what the South is like. And so it's not a concert. It's not a bunch of writers getting together and thinking they're going to do this as part of a project, but they start writing differently about the South. In some ways, critical about the South and its institutions. But what interested me was the ways in which the publishing industry was so eager for this kind of rethinking of what Southern literature might look like, right? And they published it. It was reviewed favorably. It sold well. The other part that's interesting to me is it coincides, quite literally, with the Harlem Renaissance, but they're considered two separate renaissances. So it doesn't work quite as well as they think it does. Right, but it was, again, an effort to reframe what Southern literature might look like. Right, not big plantations and magnolia trees and all the stuff that you get from Southern living.
Alison, you write about religious folks, black and white, in the 1930s in the South. Were any of those folks white liberals?
There are a few. Yeah, if I were to differentiate Southern and Northern white liberals, I would say that the difference that actually maybe doesn't change that much over time is that Southern white liberals have to think about race. They don't necessarily have to recognize or wrestle with their own whiteness, but you can't really engage in the political system in the South in any 20th century moment and not think about race. And I think that liberals outside the South are able to operate within political systems where race is not a central question, and so are not confronted with questions about race in the way that white liberals in the South are. And I think that plays out in some really clear ways in the New Deal era. It plays out in the Great Society, and it plays out certainly in our contemporary moment. I can say more about the New Deal later, but I think I'll stop at that for now.
I mean, one of the things I've written about Southern liberals too, and one of the things that I do, a contextualizing point is that I often like to make is that as late as 1938, FDR is calling the South the nation's #1 economic problem, and the South was an entirely. It's easy to forget today living in a city like Atlanta, but the South really was a separate, economy, and the levels of poverty in the white and black community, in black and white community, were just of a wholly different order than the rest of the country. And one of the things that a Southern liberal in the 1930s and 40s believed in, they believed in Franklin Roosevelt. They believed because Franklin Roosevelt brought an attention to the South, and he brought money to the South and resources on an order that had never been done before. And so And so Southern liberals, New Deal Southerners, who were central to the passage of that legislation, that made the New Deal, they believed, their vision of the future was that an economic development in the South is like a rising tide that would raise all boats, black and white, right? And looking back on them, their huge blind spot, because, we see the blind spots of the people who lived before us because, they're dead and they don't know what we know. They didn't know what we know. But their blind spot, obviously, was on race, and particularly on segregation, because most Southern liberals, well into the 1950s, were not calling for an end to segregation. And you look back and like, how could they not do that? How could they not speak out against segregation? And I think if they were here with us, if Ralph McGill was sitting there, or and Lillian Smith was sitting there, and she would be having his lunch, because she was always at, on him about that. Ralph McGill was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. He would say, I'm not going to present that easy of a target to my political opponents, right? Because there was the dominant political forces, the dominant white political forces in the South were so eager to oppose the New Deal and oppose all liberal economic reforms by saying that they're all about promoting social equality, right? And therefore we can defeat them. Because the segregationist forces were also the forces that were in cahoot with the most conservative and reactionary economic forces in the South. And so white liberals, Southern liberals, and this is an era that ends in the 1960s. It ends, but that's always the kind of counterforce that they were working on. They had to deal with the reality of an entrenched segregationist political power, that they were always having to navigate between that and with people on their left, like Lillian Smith, or like members of the Southern Conference of Human Welfare, who had much more radical ideas for social and economic reform, but who were always in a tiny minority within the region and didn't have any real political power, and didn't have a platform like Ralph McGill had as the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. So that's the complex middle terrain that a Southern liberal in the South operated in from the 1930s to the 1960s. And I think there are analogous complicated terrains in which white liberals operate today, and it's probably instructive for us to think about those different contexts.
So I would say, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
But now, Alison
I'm
is a
gonna argue
Southern
with Joe
historian
again.
too, and that's the great thing about history is people can disagree. So Alison,
I'm going to disagree with
please
Joe.
go ahead.
I don't think that race was a blind spot. I think that if you were present in the 1930s South and you were part of the Popular Front, say, which is a coalition of liberals on the left, and I work especially on the left. I'm right now working on a project that focuses on white Christian, interracial, but mostly white Christian socialists in the 1930s and 40s. You couldn't not think about race.
Right.
And so we have to decide, and what we characterize as liberal, you sort of characterize white liberals as over and against segregationists, but and Ira Katz-Nelson has written a lot about this, one of the most powerful forces in the South in the New Deal era, right, are segregationist, statist Southerners, right? They believe in a public good, they want to build a New Deal state, and they want to do it in a way that excludes Black Southerners, and that is explicit and specific.
Yeah.
And too many racially liberal white Southerners agree that that's a reasonable compromise. We'll build the state and we'll deal with the question of race later. And whether the segregationists they're working with count as liberals, I guess we could debate that. But I think what's really interesting about the New Deal era is that you do have this sort of set of Popular Front coalitions, and so liberals are in a position of figuring out when they're going to ally with the left, with the socialists and the communists, which they often do, and do in several New Deal programs. There are New Deal programs that bend toward rather than away from racial justice. Or they're going to compromise with the segregationist Democrats, who, let's remember, these are Democrats in the 1930s, like they're not the liberals in the South, right? This is a moment when they start to become that, but they're the Confederates, right? And so this is a moment of realignment wherein I think those political categories get really, really, really slippery. And so I think at least the people I work on, the people that I write about, my first book was about Mississippi and Arkansas and Memphis, and the book I'm writing now is about North Carolina. I did once write a long paper about Atlanta and like Will Alexander and the Commission on Interracial Cooperation, but take someone like Will Alexander or someone like Brooks Hayes. Brooks Hayes was a racial liberal in the
Tell them who Brooks Hayes is.
I'm about to do that.
Oh, sorry.
Brooks Hayes is a racial liberal in Arkansas in the 1930s who really advocates for the rights of farmers. He works as a part of the New Deal coalition, and he sort of takes this turn in the end of 1930s, and he signs the, oh my gosh, what's it called, Joe? Oh my gosh, this is a big brain fart. The segregationist statement is
the Southern Manifesto.
Thank you. He signs the Southern Manifesto, right? So you could say that this was sort of his path all along, but he has this moment of racial liberalism where he's actually advocating for the rights of Black Southerners as part of the New Deal, and then he sort of makes this move. And I think that is part of the way that this political realignment is shaking out in the 1930s and the 1940s, and the kind of high tide of racial liberalism that happens in the 30s and then falls on its face in the Cold War with the closing off of the economic left. But this is why I think the 30s are so interesting, right? Because it's really hard to figure out who's what is liberal, especially in the South in the 30s. Are we talking on questions of race? Are we talking on questions of building a state, sort of idea of the public good and who's part of the public good? And those things may start to clarify themselves in later decades. I'm actually not quite so sure about that either.
I think I take everything you say as is exactly right. I think I was kind of collapsing the Southern liberalism of the 30s and the 60s, but you have thank you for that. Thank you for that.
So Joe, just I'm going to do C and E together.
Okay, good.
So we're having this discussion about, okay, so what do white liberals do right and what do they do wrong? So let's just kind of flesh that out and think about sort of for balance and nuance, what's right about the project, and then also what's wrong about the project, and then we'll drill down a little deeper. I'll start with Nichole.
Okay. What's right about the project? It is aspirational. I think that's what's right about the project. So, although I study history and I'm not a historian, for what has just transpired, the fact that white liberals had aspirations for social change and structural transformation around, and I guess despite all of what was happening in American society, is aspirational and worthy of mention, as well as the work that continues to happen with even today with respect to white liberals. You could say in the civil rights movements, the representatives, the white representatives that built coalitions were white liberals. So there's this history of wanting or desiring social transformation or social change. But also, as I listen to my colleagues, what is problematic is the compromises. There's always a compromise. And can you, and I draw on sociologists Omi and Monat, racial formation, they talk about America being a racial state. We cannot get away from race in America. They talk about a nation paradigm, a nation paradigm of race race is in the social fabric. And so can we afford to make those types of compromises when, I guess when Black people or people of color lives are really on the line? And so that is problematic, and also part of the problem is, and you two just debated this, is part of the problem that that race is invisibilized, ignored, invisibilized meaning really not seen, which is different from it being ignored, knowing that it is part of the structure, yet in efforts at social transformation and change, it not fully being addressed, so that the recipients of the change, their really status will be raised. So it won't just be about racial equity, but really racial equality. Like you really are seen as equal and valued as such.
And so one thing I was thinking about as you were speaking is I just finished reading Jason Mott's Hell of a Book. If you've not read Jason Mott's novel, Hell of a Book, I recommend it.
It's a hell of a book.
It's a hell of a book.
It's a hell of a book. It's a hell of a book. That's a theme and a catchline that goes through all of it. Well-intentioned people. Oh my God, another shooting. Isn't that terrible? Oh my God, another Black man shot down the street. Isn't that terrible? Right, so a kind of perfunctory response of outrage with no action. But it's terrible, isn't it terrible? And we can all just go around saying, isn't it terrible? And feel good because we recognize that it's terrible. Right. So I think that gets tied into it. One of the edited collections that I worked on that Joe mentioned was the lost lectures of C. Van Woodward. You're sort of a quintessential
Emory graduate.
I'm sorry?
An Emory
graduate, right? Who almost didn't, lore has it, right? That was when he was at Chapel Hill that he wasn't going to pass his comps, and we're like, oh my God, if C. Van Woodward's not going to pass his comps, there's no hope for any of us, right? But the quintessential white liberal, and he's writing about Reconstruction in one of these lost lectures, most of them centered on the period of Reconstruction. And he says, here's why it failed. Because the North didn't really mean it. And Woodward fails too. And I think it's because he didn't really mean it, right? So he thought he meant it, right? He kind of worked with John Hope Franklin to integrate professional conferences and all of these sorts of things, but there was no, what do I want? There was nothing, there was no substance behind it. And it wasn't something that he could fully commit to. Now there are all kinds of reasons why that might be the case. But he didn't really mean it. When it came down to it, like what's going to happen, right? He didn't really mean it. Just like when he was talking about Reconstruction era politicians who championed, right? These are senators who wrote legislation, didn't write legislation, but they enacted legislation to protect the formerly enslaved, and then just gave up on them. was there and then it wasn't.
Alison, did you want to speak to this issue of what white liberals do right, either historically or presently?
I feel like I've talked a lot, so.
So we do want to talk about like a couple of issues that I think some people kind of pinpoint. So one of them is this idea of the speed at which change should happen. African Americans are pushing for change. There's certainly a wing of African American activists who are pushing for rapid change, and who are perceived in some instances as being impatient. And white liberals are among those who call for moderation, for incremental change, for making things slow. Is that something that's inherent to white liberalism, to want to do things slow?
Inherent? Maybe.
Or intentional?
Intentional. Yeah, I mean, when I saw that question, I had Nina Simone in the back of my head, like, or is it, Nina Simone, right, go slow. All right, you can't unhear it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Mississippi goddamn, right? So I'm sorry, I'm just thinking about this question about inherently, is it somehow in the genetic, somehow in the genetic code?
But I think it is in the political philosophy of liberalism.
Yeah.
Liberals believe in institutions.
Yeah, that's exactly
And
right.
institutions move slowly. We're all at a big, or most of us work at a big institution that moves really slowly. And they believe in the political process. And the political process is full of compromise and half loaves and deals and that take a lot of time, and that, and proposals that get shot down or buried in committees or the rest. And so, if you believe in those processes, if you believe in institutions, you've got, it's going to require time. And so, and it's going to be frustrating to people who are on the outside of those institutions. It's going to be frustrating to people who have waited far too long. It's frustrating to people the rhetoric of the institutions or the nation never has lived up to the promise. So they do move slowly.
So Alison, since you grabbed the mic, let's think about this from a religious standpoint. Religious institutions often want to go slow. And so when we think about sort of the classic critique of people going slow, we could think of Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he's targeting white moderates, people who probably consider themselves somewhat liberal, but were some of the main ones who were critiquing King and the SCLC for trying to push things too hard, too fast. So can you sort of talk about this from a theological and a denominational perspective?
Yeah. Well, so there's a question about religion, and then there's a question about religious institutions, which are two separate questions, right? Religious institutions and religious motivations are not overlapping. And I mean, I study the Christian left, right? So I study people whose work is often anti or super institutional, because institutions do tend to move slowly. I wouldn't say that religious institutions move more slowly than other institutions. This is an institutional question, not a theological or religious one. I do want to sort of parse out this moderate liberal thing, right? Like King's critique in the letter to Birmingham jail is very specifically of white moderates, and in part I think that's a careful rhetorical move, but I think it's also an important rhetorical move. And I'm gonna take a tangent here, but I'm gonna bring it back. I am from rural Appalachia. I am from a county in North Carolina that is like 90-something% Republican, because it was like 90-something% Union. And it never realigned, right? Like it's just stuck with whatever's Republican at any given time, and so now it's like 90% Trump. My dad was a Southern Baptist preacher who was kicked out of his church when I was 11 because he was too liberal. My dad was not liberal. Like I say now as somebody who's like pretty far to the left, and he is too, that he wasn't, right? And so I think that I think moderate's a real category, and it has to do with the way people attach to and understand institutions. And I also think that the liberal attachment to institutions is important, but it also reflects a class-specific understanding of liberalism, right? It is middle and upper-class elite liberals who are particularly attached to institutions because it is elites who have access to those institutions and who understand how they work and who know how to be a part of them. And so I think it's actually often why the lower middle and lower class categories of whiteness sort of skip the liberal and go to the left. But I think that now to sort of come back to the question of institutions, I think if you think about liberalism as something beyond an attachment to institutions and think of it instead as sort of coming back to what Nichole said about a capacity for an understanding of structural injustice and a structural critique, whether it's then acted on or not, then you have a category of liberalism that is less class specific. And so then the question is, why is it that white people across classes who can see and recognize structural injustice still sit on their hands or sit on other people's hands, right? And want to sort of slow walk a lot of sort of movements for change. And I think that's a really important question that doesn't just stick us with kind of institutions as the only thing that keeps that from happening. And I don't have an answer to that. I just want to sort of shift the question a little bit.
I mean, as a social scientist, the things that I would be looking for then, if it's not the institutions, then I would look to behavior, right? And if you look at underlying attitudes and behavior, my friend Vince Hutchings from the University of Michigan did this during looking at Obama's election. Racial resentment amongst self-described liberals was negatively correlated with support for Barack Obama. So there were people who considered themselves liberals who were actually very reluctant and in some instances didn't vote for Barack Obama despite that self-proclaimed ideological liberalism that we kind of think of today and kind of the current kind of. And so the idea that you could actually still see an effect of racial resentment in terms of Democratic support for Barack Obama was actually, was telling in those instances. So what about, another thing in terms of process and how institutions work? And so sometimes there's this idea of self-determination. So in particular with SNCC, we know that, there comes that moment in the mid-1960s where there's a schism. And you have the Black nationalists, and then you have the people who are committed to integration, and integration is lost. And that included white liberals. And the whole idea for SNCC going Black nationalism was, as the late Charles Hamilton and Stokely Carmichael articulated in Black Power, was about self-determination. Blacks needed to achieve their freedom by themselves. So even though multiracial partnerships were good up to a point, there had to come a point where blacks had to carry it over the finish line, at least they always were beholden to whites. And it kind of inherent in that critique or that discussion was the idea that sometimes when blacks and whites in this particular case were in partnership with each other, that there might be a tendency for whites to kind of take over and kind of overshadow the blacks who, they were, in a well-meaning way trying to help and articulate. So I want you to think a little bit about that instinct of being in charge of liberation struggles and knowing kind of like when to sit back and when to kind of be at the forefront. Like, what does allyship kind of mean in those instances? So I can start with anybody. Since Nichole, you were shaking your head.
So ask the question, the last part of the.
So I just want to think about sort of this critique of white liberals in multiracial coalition for freedom struggles, always wanting to be in charge, or at least there's a perception. It's not always true, but the perception and the critique of white liberalism is that whites have to be in charge and they don't know how to kind of like step back and follow and take the lead of people of color who are articulating their own needs and their own desires and their own capacity to be able to do this for themselves.
And so the question is why there is...
Why? And sort of, can you tease out that critique, provide more examples, and elaborate on that?
Oh my goodness, that's a complex question. Because you provide the critique from the Black perspective of what happens with alliances. I mean, I think the mindset, so how about this? Allow me to speak from what I think, and I don't want to be the representative voice for Black people, but I think that Black people know how to choose our leaders and our leadership. Asking for help doesn't mean that you end up defining our institutions, our organizations, who we choose to forge ahead with respect to the freedom struggles in which we participate in. And for that reason, I can see it being problematic if we say that we are in coalition. And I mean, I think a great example of this is the 2020 after George Floyd Black Lives Matter movement that was domestic and turned global because of the murder of George Floyd. In that case, and I don't know if it was, or there may be something to it being a youth-led movement, and because, and interestingly enough, when we think about historically, I mean, the civil rights movement was led by young people. There's something to be said about that in terms of young people, not just maybe critiquing white people in terms of their demands, what they're asking for, but also Black elders, and so the youthful voice is what was so present that no one really can take over that movement. But then also on the flip side, as you know, with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement, there are critiques amongst the ranks around that movement. But then I think that there's always going to be critiques when we are thinking about movements and young people. So you ask a challenging question that I can't answer from the perspective of a white liberal, but from the perspective of someone who is Black and studies social movements.
Sarah. Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to contribute to this conversation. Comments that.
I can't hear you. Put your mic up closer. Talking to the mic.
Sorry, what I was saying was I'm not sure I have much that I could add to what has already been said. I can perhaps think about how it works how that plays out at my own institution in terms of committee structures, committee appointments, and who's in charge of those committee appointments, and why we might want to think of having a different structure for those committee appointments. Right, I mean, so that's very institutional and sort of inside baseball-y-ish, and doesn't take us outside of the institution, at least not initially. It does go outside of the institution because the kinds of programming that I think that comes out of these committees and out of these conversations that literally goes outside. It's for the community, right? Which includes my institution's community, but mostly it's for the people who live in the neighborhoods that surround us, right? The ones that weren't raised when someone decided, well, that's where Black people lived, and so we can just tear those houses down and do something else with that land, right? But that stopped happening a long time ago, right? And so the kinds of programming that I'm thinking about that comes out from this kind of committee structure, and who sits back and listens to other people and don't dominate the conversation, and sometimes maybe not say much of anything. And that can be a strategy, not saying anything, not pretending that I have something to say that would supersede or even be equal with what has already been said.
I add briefly.
Okay, sorry, I might have turned it off. Sorry.
I think that one of the reasons that we have the power dynamics we do is that we're socialized into what has for centuries been a white patriarchal order, right? And so that socialization does not map completely onto identity, right? That socialization means that for people who have access to or identify with the sort of categories of white, like men, white people, people of wealth, you could add Protestants, you could sort of add a category. When you're socialized into those systems of power, then you tend to operate as a person with power. And so it takes an intentional effort on the part of people who have been socialized into those forms of power to let go of them. And it also actually takes an intentional effort on the part of people who have been socialized either into alternative systems of power or outside systems of power to kind of think through that. So talking about SNCC and your wonderful example, Nichole, I mean, the model of sort of democratic leadership is Ella Baker, right? Mm-hmm. Now, Ella Baker wasn't just a really phenomenal democratic leader. Ella Baker is the woman, for anyone who might need a refresher, right? Who helped organize student sit-ins, who was in a quasi-leadership role with SNCC. She worked with the SCLC first. She left because she didn't like being told what to do by men. And we haven't talked about gender much here.
That's right.
But
She's pushed to the side.
Ella Baker actually disagreed with SNCC's move to eliminate white students, but Ella Baker said, this isn't my movement, right? Good people, she said, what was it, good people don't need good leaders, it's not good, it's something else. And I'm losing the quote, but she understood, not because it was intuitive or reflexive, but because she did a lot of work to think about democratic freedom movements. She understood that it wasn't her place to say what the students in SNCC were going to get to do. And so I think there is a reflexive tendency on the part of people who have power and who have access to power to act like people who have power and who have access to power. And we have to work really hard to stop doing that.
Yeah. Or at least to be mindful of it. Yeah. Know when to step back.
I think we should go to questions, yeah?
So one final question.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So let's think about promoting solidarity, what the notion of allyship is. I mean, that's the reason why we care about white liberalism, is that this might be impeding allyship in ways that we don't want to think about that make us uncomfortable. So in a perfect world, what does allyship, or if you prefer the term co-conspiratorship, what does that look like? How would you envision that?
You know, as I've been sitting here and listening to us for the last hour, it dawned on me, although it's in the scholarship, that when we think about white liberals, we are thinking about the notion of what it means politically. So liberal. We're also talking about white liberals as a political entity. We're talking about them sociologically. We're also talking about them philosophically, it dawned on me, I said, well, at least we don't conflate white liberals in the same way we conflate white conservatives with whiteness, or really more white evangelicals with a political entity. And so whiteness as like an oppressive term. So I think that that's interesting. I'm thinking about how we presently conflate religious terminology and the political. And so, I mean, like I often explain to Black people that, you know, or Black Christians, at the heart, we are evangelicals. Like if you look at the term evangel and look at the root, evangel just means good news. But because evangelicalism is now a loaded term because of the ways in which the political is inherent, it's conflated when people don't want to identify as evangelical.
Mm-hmm.
Black, other people of color, no, we're Black Christians, but we have to look all the way to the history of being a Black Christian, which is evangelical roots, the Great Awakening. So, you know, the two streams of Black evangelicalism is or Black Christianity or Afro-Protestantism is evangelicalism that came about because of whites, as well as the ways in which, so this pietistic and this protest. But when we think about evangelicalism, it codes for white. It codes for structures that are oppressive. Not in the same way as white liberals, which is what I think, and maybe because we don't think about it that deeply or so deeply. And so allyship, I think that allyship comes out of what we have been talking about for the last hour. Allyship is the philosophical roots of white liberalism, economic justice, social change, uplifting the civil and human rights of individuals. All that is life-giving and flourishing about what it means to be a white liberal, but at the same time, just how we ended just a minute ago, which is once you are an ally, recognizing your whiteness, your white privilege, and how to be able to put that down when it's time to relinquish it. I think that is part of being a good white liberal ally, knowing how to relinquish white privilege or your white privilege at the time that it needs to be known when to step back.
Sarah.
Oh, here.
Sorry.
It's on. You don't have to touch
right.
it.
What can I add to that? Ask questions when they're appropriate, and shut up when it's appropriate. That's in 4 words. Essentially it. Listen a lot. And listen hard. And take in what you're hearing and act on it. I have nothing profound to add. I dumb things to say, but nothing profound.
Easy to say and hard to do.
To add, right? But and I say this genuinely.
Yeah.
Right? Listen to what people are saying and act accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should have let Nichole go last. So you have the last word. So maybe you can go again. But allyship, I think, is knowing when to speak up and when to shut up, and I hate taglines, so that's not one. I think one of the things that's really hard to do when you sort of think coalitionally is then doing what you're told, and I think allyship is in part like doing what you're told when you're told. And what one example, in 2016, Anthea Butler said something on Twitter. She said, like, white liberals get your people. and I thought, oh, like, that's what I don't want to do, right? I don't want to go back home and talk to the people I grew up with in white Appalachia who made my childhood pretty miserable, actually. But that's what Anthea Butler's telling me to do, and so maybe this is what I have to figure out how to do. And so I think it's sometimes doing what you're told, even when it sounds really awful.
So on that note, we want to open this up to the audience. I think this is a small enough room that people can feel free to just stand up and state their name and project to ask their questions. But if you do happen to be shy and you are on social media and you're on Twitter or X, if you want to send us a question using the hashtag JWJI White Liberalism, I'm happy to read your question for you. So with that, Ms. Gillespie.
Thank you, first of all, for all the work that you have done in your work and your academic work and all, and thank you for this conversation. I have a really, really small question. Early on, I think, Sarah, you spoke about the plantation, and you referred to the, your main point, of course, was that whose voice is the most legitimate and so on, and whose statement is most legitimate. But my concern or interest is that you used the word planter, and I found it a very gentle term rather than enslaver. I just wondered if that was intentional, or does it, they both the same to you, or because I just thought about that. And
I almost always say enslaver. And if I don't use the word enslaver, it's because I've already said it 72 times in class, and it's just using a different term. I suppose it's possible. No, I don't suppose it's possible. It's possible I use the word planter because that's how they used it, and in one of the things I do in that class is we talk about the superstructures that allowed for the creation of a slave society. What needs to happen, right? You need to make laws, right? That's one thing. You need to enlist religion to be on the side of the enslavers, right? You need to, right? There are all of these things that happen because people make them happen to legitimize, right, an enslaved society. So sometimes I will use the word not interchangeably in terms of meaning, but sometimes to emphasize that that's how they saw it, but also sometimes just because I've said enslaver 79 times. Thank you. It's a good question, though. We have these kinds of conversations in class, too, if they wonder.
Other questions? Dr. Kahn.
I'm Henry Kahn, and I was provoked by Professor Gillespie's opening comments about how young she is, because I was a part of the Freedom Summer, a volunteer Freedom Summer, and 3 years before that, I attempted to witness integration of Atlanta's public schools at Northside High School. It didn't go well. But I think what may be missing from most of this discussion as we seek to understand better the essence of white liberalism is we're not acknowledging the roles played by socialists and communists in that same period. You mentioned those two words slip right out of your mouth, and then they were dropped, but they shouldn't be dropped. I can tell you that from my experience in those roles, that I found it easy to see that socialists and communists were behaving, and most of them were white, not all, most of them were white, were behaving in ways that didn't conform with this definition of liberalism and its deficits. It was really quite important. There were socialists and communists, you now know, in the New Deal. I grew up in Dutchess County, New York, in the shadow of Franklin Roosevelt. And I consider myself an amateur historian of the New Deal, but they were there. And among the 3 young men who died so horribly in the first weeks of Freedom Summer, Mickey Schwerner, whom you mentioned, was from a communist family. And I learned a number of insights like that, which I don't think we should ignore. They should not be banned from your scholarly investigations. You need to look harder. There are plenty of books on the subject. They come up in Robin Kelly's book, Hammer and Hoe. He acknowledges the importance of the Communist Party. I don't say that because they were perfect. Far from it. They made many mistakes. I could see that, I could smell it, and it wasn't pleasant. But the importance of their movement comes in how seriously their allyship was feared by the conservatives in the South. And with the notable exception of Joseph McCarthy, almost all of the other legislative investigators of communists in our life were Southern congresspeople, Southern senators. I mean, Senator Bilbo, possibly the worst, but there were plenty vying for that title. There were Southern Dixiecrats, Democrats, who found it essential to focus on the inroads made by communists because they were the ones who actually were talking to blacks in a way that made sense. Or the whites who led much of the defense of the Scottsboro Wars in the 1930s. If you don't add that to your scholarship, I think you're leaving something out.
Thank you for raising the question, Alison. I think Seth would be the natural person to respond.
So I didn't talk a lot about socialists and communists. They're actually, I work on Christian socialists because they don't to me fall within the category of liberal, right? They are a category to the left of liberal. I did mention the Popular Front, and the Popular Front is the moment when socialists and communists are at the, well, you could argue that socialists were at the peak of their power for several decades before that, but there's this sort of apex of the power of socialists and communists in actually manipulating the levers of in accessing levers of power in the political system because they are part of the Popular Front, this alliance between communists, socialists, and liberals. And it is the socialists and communists in the South, as you've said, who because they see racial and economic justice as inextricable, who are absolutely committed and don't compromise on questions of race. Their language about race is often clumsy. Their ways of understanding race are often inadequate. Their political and affiliations don't give them some sort of special understanding, but they do impart a particular kind of commitment to racial justice that really doesn't have a parallel among liberals who didn't share that economic critique. The people that I work on, it's an organization called the Fellowship of Southern Churchmen, which was a Christian socialist organization started in Chapel Hill in the 1930s, ceases to identify its membership as socialist in the 1940s. They hire this woman, Nell Morton, who I work on a little bit, because she's been in Presbyterian education. They forget that she's also like the only white Southern Presbyterian woman who remained pacifist throughout World War II. Because they think she's sort of like, she's palatable, right? She's a white woman in Christian education. She'll be nice and won't rock the boat. And I'm writing a book about this interracial Christian work camp she sends out to Eastern North Carolina to work with a farmers cooperative. Now, farmers cooperatives could appeal across economic categories. But this effort is like, it's pretty left. And so I think socialists and communists are essential to the story. Their absence in the wake of McCarthyism is also essential to the story of why liberalism moves very far to the right in the aftermath of McCarthyism. And so liberals cease to have to work with socialists and communists, and they respond much more to the Dixiecrats and to the far right. And so it is not only the influence of the socialists and communists, but their presence in the political system. And the concept of the Overton window I recognize as like a sort of conservative concept. But it's also a useful one to think about the way in which, that's the idea that that the political system exists on poles as if it's only a single spectrum, and that the window is always going to be in the middle. So if you move the left or the right very far to the left or the right, then you move the window. So if you cut off like all of the left, then you're suddenly moving that window a lot further to the right, which is I think what we've done. But yeah, thank you for that comment. It's really important. And for your work in Freedom Summer. I'd love to talk to you about it.
Other questions? I have a couple more minutes. We can do one or two. Yes.
Okay. I don't remember which of you said it, perhaps Sarah, but you commented about social outrage with no action. And so I'm a retiree from a state system university in Missouri, and I was the only Black in the counseling service, the only Black that, had to come forth whenever there was a racial issue or when the psychology department didn't pass accreditation. They pulled the same group of us together. And so I was down the street from where Michael Brown was killed. I was in Ferguson, and I hated going to work because the liberals, I could see them coming with the look on their face, and I'm just like, and so my question is, when you're in situation after situation after situation where you're hearing the right words about multiculturalism, blah, 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 but you're not seeing action to go with it, what are your recommendations for people like me to do other than vomit, which I always felt like vomiting?
Are we sure that's not the appropriate response? It's a wonderful question. I don't know if I have the kind of an answer that would be even fair to the question. Again, I think listening.
Get your people.
And get your people. Yeah, listening. And then act on what's act.
Yeah, no,
Just say act.
I think the thing
Sorry.
that kind of comes to mind was after George Floyd died, when everybody issued their press releases and their statements. I remembered one organization that I'm affiliated with issued a statement. I know it was completely well-meaning. I adore the person who came up with it, but I was like, there are bigger problems in this organization. So this statement is nice, but why don't you work on having folks actually speak to people in the hallways, basic stuff like, I don't like microaggressions in this space, and they happen all the time. And I didn't feel empowered to be able to say anything about it. It was like, I accept this as the good faith effort that it was, but this would be a time where people who are in more privileged positions of power could stand up and say, this is really nice, but this isn't enough, and if we're not manifesting this in kind of our day-to-day relations with people, the next time this has happened, you're just going to say the same thing over again, and it's going to be completely meaningless. And so I think, that idea, that Anthea Butler idea of go get your people, I think is actually really appropriate here. And this is a place where people can exert power, right? Where people, and it also shows people putting skin in the game, because the reason why I couldn't say anything was, as a minoritized person, I was definitely in a more vulnerable position. And it could be that a white person who cares about these things might lose some capital by doing that, but the expenditure of capital is actually something that is important. And it actually sends a really important signal, and most of the time people do things that don't cost them kind of social or political capital, which is why other people from the outside look on it and are like, that's pretty feckless, and no, I'm not, not that impressed with the effort, but thank you. So any other questions? Well, I hope you are all on our mailing list, not just for our colloquium events and our public dialogues, but also so when we do announce the date for the white nationalism event, we hope that you can come back to that and bring friends. We're going to do one more evening event this semester. It's going to be our James Weldon Johnson annual lecture. So that's going to be on April 11th at 5 p.m. And so I'm pleased to announce that our speaker is going to be Dr. Michael Dawson of the University of Chicago, so that should be a really good event. So with that, please join me in thanking our panel and thanking Joe for